Beneath the velvet sky of ancient Egypt, the Nile drifted slowly, its waters glowing silver in the moonlight. The air was warm, carrying the faint perfume of lotus blossoms, and in the distance, the hushed murmur of Alexandria whispered of secrets. Tonight, we step into that world, a kingdom where power and beauty walked hand in hand, and where one woman, more than any other, would etch her name into history: Cleopatra. A queen remembered not only for her crown, but for her brilliance, her courage, and the delicate balance she held between love and survival. Her story begins not in triumph, but in the fragile uncertainty of a dynasty trembling beneath Rome's shadow. If you stood along the banks of the Nile on such a night, what would you hear first? The gentle lap of water, or the footsteps of destiny approaching? Share your answer in the comments and let us know where you're listening from and whether it is morning, evening, or night for you. And if you enjoy journeys like this one, don't forget to subscribe and gently tap the like button. It helps us bring more timeless stories to you. Now dim your screen, let the air grow still, and follow the river's path into a city of marble columns and flickering oil lamps, to the moment where Cleopatra's story truly begins. The river moved like liquid glass beneath the glow of the moon. Along its banks, reeds rustled softly in the night breeze, and a heron lifted its wings with the patience of a world that had already seen thousands of years unfold. The Nile was the heart of Egypt, steady, eternal, and nourishing. And in its quiet rhythm lay the story of a land that had given birth to gods, to pyramids, to dynasties long remembered. It was into this timeless current that Cleopatra would one day step, a figure both mortal and unforgettable. But before she was queen, before her name became legend, the Egypt she inherited was already a place unlike any other. By the time of her birth in 69 BCE, the kingdom was a dazzling blend of cultures. Ancient pharaonic traditions fused with Greek language and customs, the result of centuries of rule by the Ptolemaic dynasty. Imagine standing at the harbour of Alexandria, Cleopatra's birthplace. The sea air carries the salt of the Mediterranean, and marble statues gleam in torchlight. To your right, the great Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, sends its beacon far into the dark. To your left, the Library of Alexandria holds scrolls said to contain all the wisdom of mankind. And somewhere within the palace walls, a child sleeps, unaware that the world around her will one day bend to her choices. Cleopatra's Egypt was at once magnificent and fragile. Though outwardly splendid, the Ptolemaic court was entangled in struggles, family rivalries, fragile alliances, and the looming shadow of Rome. The Ptolemies themselves were not native Egyptians. They were of Macedonian Greek descent, tracing their lineage back to Ptolemy I, the general and companion of Alexander the Great. And yet, in Cleopatra, there would be something different. Unlike many of her predecessors, she would embrace not only her Greek heritage, but also the traditions of Egypt itself. She would learn the language of the people, the chants of the priests, and the rituals of the old gods. But on this first night, let us slow the pace. Close your eyes and picture Alexandria at dusk, the streets alive with the hum of traders calling out their wares. Spices from Arabia, papyrus scrolls carried from the Nile Delta, jewelry of lapis lazuli and gold glinting in the last light of the sun. Lamps flicker to life one by one, casting golden halos across stone courtyards. Above, the stars of the desert sky appear, brighter than any seen from Rome, brighter than any city lights we know today. Can you imagine walking down these narrow streets at night, the scent of baking bread mixing with the salt of the sea? It was in this world that Cleopatra's early life began. Though the palace walls shielded her from much of the struggle beyond, the air of politics and intrigue was impossible to escape. For the Ptolemaic dynasty was no ordinary family. Brothers and sisters married each other to keep power within the royal bloodline. Fathers named children as co-rulers, only for them to be betrayed by their kin. The throne was both a prize and a peril, and every heir grew up knowing that trust was a dangerous luxury. The Nile itself seemed to mirror this duality, life-giving and yet merciless in its floods. Each year, the river swelled, covering fields with fertile silt, ensuring harvests that could feed the kingdom. Yet if the waters rose too high, villages drowned. If too little, famine followed. For Egyptians, the Nile was a god, a source of devotion and fear. For Cleopatra, it would always be the thread tying her reign to the very heartbeat of her land. Now let us linger a moment on the sounds of that river. Hear the lap of waves against wooden boats tied at the docks. Hear the soft creak of oars dipping into water as fishermen begin their nightly labour. Somewhere in the distance, a flute plays, a melody rising and falling like the current itself. And in the royal palace, quiet conversations flicker like the lamplight, voices speaking in both Greek and Egyptian, weaving together a kingdom that straddled two worlds. Cleopatra was born into this in-between space. She was neither fully Greek nor wholly Egyptian, yet in time she would become both. Her early years are not described in the same detail as those of Rome's Caesars, yet history leaves us glimpses. We know she was educated with extraordinary care, as befitted a princess. Tutors schooled her in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and rhetoric. She learned to speak fluently, not only in Greek, but in the languages of her neighboring lands, Hebrew, Aramaic, perhaps even the tongues of Nubia and Persia. Most significantly, she spoke Egyptian, becoming the first Ptolemaic ruler in centuries to do so. Imagine her as a young girl reciting the prayers of the goddess Isis in the native tongue, her voice carrying a note of reverence that many of her ancestors had neglected. But as a child, Cleopatra would also have been aware of the fragility of her family's throne. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known as Auletes, the flute player, was a king loved for his music, but criticized for his weakness. His rule was propped up by Roman support, and without it, his hold on Egypt might have slipped away. In the palace, whispers of debt and dependence floated alongside the music of the lyre. And so, from her earliest days, Cleopatra must have understood that Egypt's fate was bound not only to its river and its people, but to the distant power of Rome. Yet for all these concerns, the world of her childhood still shimmered with beauty. The palace halls opened onto gardens fragrant with myrrh and jasmine. Servants carried trays of honeyed dates and figs. Teachers unrolled papyrus scrolls written in elegant ink, their words alive with lessons from Homer, from Plato, from Egyptian hymns long before Alexander's time. Perhaps Cleopatra sat beneath a columned portico as the breeze from the sea lifted her hair, listening to her father's musicians play, her young mind already absorbing the delicate balance between performance and power. Picture her in those moments. A girl among marble columns, but with the wide, searching eyes of someone who already sensed her story would stretch far beyond the palace walls. Can you see her stepping through the corridors, her hand brushing the cool stone, pausing to watch the torches flicker against the polished bronze of a soldier's shield? Each detail around her was a lesson, in majesty, in danger, in the shadows that followed every ruler of Egypt. And outside those walls, life carried on in rhythms as old as the river. Farmers rose with the dawn to lead oxen through the fields. Children splashed in the shallows of the Nile, laughing as the reeds brushed their legs. Market stalls buzzed with chatter as fishermen offered their catch and potters displayed jars still warm from the kiln. These were Cleopatra's people, though many would never glimpse her face. Yet she, in turn, would know them, for she studied their tongue, their customs, their gods. She would become, in time, not only their queen, but their bridge between eras, the heir of Greek conquerors and the living daughter of Egypt's soil. The moon continues to shine on the river, and we leave her there for now, a child of promise, shaped by both her father's fragile reign and the ancient strength of her homeland. Ahead lay trials she could not yet imagine. Exile, alliances with men who shaped the fate of empires, and choices that would echo for millennia. But in this first glimpse, we simply see the beginning, a girl standing at the edge of two worlds, listening to the heartbeat of the Nile beneath a sky full of stars. The story of Cleopatra cannot be told without the story of the family she came from, the dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries before her birth. To understand her path, we must walk slowly backward in time, through palaces heavy with incense, through temples echoing with chants, to the moment when a new ruling house first took root on Egyptian soil. It began with Alexander the Great, whose conquests stretched like a flame across the world. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire, vast and dazzling, was divided among his generals. One of them, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, claimed Egypt. He was not Egyptian by blood, he was Macedonian, Greek, and his rule was born not from inheritance, but from ambition. Yet he was clever, practical, and understood that to hold Egypt, one had to respect its ancient traditions. Imagine Alexandria at that time, still a young city, its streets laid out in perfect grids, its harbour alive with ships carrying grain, ivory, papyrus, and incense. Ptolemy established his court here, turning the city into the jewel of the Mediterranean. He filled it with scholars, inviting thinkers from Athens and beyond to gather in the great library. He built temples in the style of the Pharaohs, for he knew the Egyptian people revered continuity. And thus, the Ptolemaic dynasty was born, foreign in blood, yet draped in the robes of Egyptian kingship. From the very start, the dynasty walked a delicate line. Outwardly, the Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs, performing the rituals, appearing in temples carved with hieroglyphs that declared them children of Ra. Inwardly, within their palaces, they spoke Greek, followed Greek customs, and intermarried among themselves to preserve their bloodline. Brothers married sisters, nieces wed uncles, cousins bound themselves together, all in the belief that purity of lineage would secure their power. Yet this insularity also bred rivalry, suspicion, and betrayal. The Ptolemaic court was a place of silks and jewels, but also of daggers hidden in shadows. Picture the great halls of their palaces, marble floors cooled by water channels, columns painted with scenes of lotus flowers and sacred falcons. Servants passed with trays of honey cakes and wine imported from the islands of the Aegean. Musicians plucked at lyres, their notes drifting into the warm evening air. Yet in the corners, conversations lowered into whispers. Which sibling would inherit? Which ally from Rome must be courted? Which rival might strike first? For the dynasty had bound itself to both glory and danger, as tightly as a lotus stem binds itself to the river bank. By the time Cleopatra was born, the dynasty had already weathered centuries of such storms. Ptolemy I, the founder, had been a skilled strategist, but his descendants often lacked his steady hand. Some kings were scholars and patrons of art. Others were weak rulers, remembered for indulgence or cruelty. And always, beneath the gilded surface, lay the question of Egypt's independence. For while the Ptolemies ruled as pharaohs, their kingdom became increasingly tied to the growing power of Rome. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was himself a product of this uneasy balance. Nicknamed Olitz, the flute player, he was known more for his music than his political strength. To secure his throne, he borrowed heavily from Rome, offering wealth and allegiance in exchange for support. The cost of this alliance weighed heavily on Egypt, draining its resources, stirring discontent among its people. It was into this fragile inheritance that Cleopatra would one day step, a throne gilded with splendor, yet balanced on the edge of dependency. Yet let us not imagine the dynasty as only a tangle of debts and disputes, for there was also brilliance, innovation, and a blending of worlds unlike any other. The Ptolemies presided over one of the greatest centers of learning the ancient world had ever known. In the library of Alexandria, shelves upon shelves of scrolls held the words of poets, philosophers, scientists, and physicians. Here, scholars dissected the mysteries of the stars, charted the paths of comets, measured the circumference of the earth, and studied the ebb and flow of the Nile. Knowledge flowed like the river itself, carrying ideas from Greece, Mesopotamia, India, and beyond. And in the temples, rituals as old as the pyramids continued. Priests dressed in white linen poured libations to the gods, chanting hymns in hieroglyphs. Incense rose in curling smoke, carrying prayers to Isis, Osiris, and Horus. The dynasty had embraced this duality. Greek thought in the library, Egyptian faith in the temples. It was a kingdom of two languages, two identities, woven together. Cleopatra grew within this tapestry. She was not the first princess to be born of such a union of worlds, but she would be the one to master it most completely. Unlike many of her forebears, who remained aloof from the Egyptian people, Cleopatra studied their traditions, spoke their language, and presented herself as their true daughter. But this we shall see more clearly in time. For now, we must dwell on the dynasty itself, a family both dazzling and doomed. Can you imagine the childhood of a Ptolemaic prince or princess, raised within palaces, guarded by soldiers, surrounded by luxury, yet knowing always that danger lurked among one's kin? A brother might become a rival. A sister might be a future queen, or a threat. Every smile could conceal ambition. Every gesture of kindness could be a calculation. And yet, amid this, there were moments of beauty, festivals along the Nile, when barges glittered with lanterns, processions in which the royal family appeared before cheering crowds, hunts in the desert, where falcons soared and chariots sped across the sand. The dynasty was, in truth, a mirror of Egypt itself, glorious yet vulnerable, steeped in tradition, yet tied to foreign powers, radiant in art and learning, yet shadowed by unrest. And Cleopatra, last of its rulers, would carry all these contradictions within her. As the moon rises over Alexandria, casting silver upon the marble columns, let us pause to feel the weight of that inheritance. A house of Pharaohs and Greeks, bound by ambition, torn by rivalries, and destined to leave behind one of history's most enduring figures. In the next moments, we shall turn from the dynasty at large to the girl who grew within it, a child in the palace whose path was already being shaped by forces she could not yet name. The palace in Alexandria was more than stone and marble. It was a world unto itself, a city within the city. Its columns rose high into the air, painted in brilliant colours that caught the sunlight and gleamed like jewels. Gardens bloomed behind its walls, fragrant with roses, myrrh and jasmine. Fountains murmured softly, their streams of water catching the golden glow of the Mediterranean sun. It was here, among courtyards shaded by date palms and corridors lined with statues of gods, that Cleopatra spent her earliest days. She was born in 69 BCE, the daughter of Ptolemy XII, called Auletes, and most likely Cleopatra V Tryphena. The exact identity of her mother remains a mystery, as so much of her life does, yet we know the child who would one day be queen was not born into simplicity. From her first breath, she was wrapped in silk, guarded by soldiers, and lulled to sleep by the music of harps and flutes. But she was also born into uncertainty. Her father's rule was fragile, supported more by Roman favour than by the strength of his own throne. And within the palace, ambition and rivalry stirred like restless winds. For Cleopatra, childhood was not just play, but preparation. Tutors guided her days with discipline. At dawn, when the city still lay in a hush, she would be led to a shaded chamber where scrolls were unrolled before her. She studied the words of Homer, tracing the journeys of Odysseus, the fall of Troy, the wisdom of philosophers. She learned mathematics, the careful measuring of numbers and angles, the rhythms of the stars. She studied astronomy, gazing at the night sky over Alexandria, where constellations burned brighter than they do for us today. And she learned the art of rhetoric, the shaping of words into power, for in Egypt, as in Rome, speech could command armies as surely as gold. But what set Cleopatra apart was her ear for languages. Many of her ancestors had ruled Egypt without ever bothering to speak the language of its people. They had clung to Greek, surrounding themselves with a court that looked more to Athens than to Memphis or Thebes. Cleopatra was different. From her earliest lessons, she showed not only intelligence, but a hunger to connect. She learned Egyptian, mastering the chants of priests and the poetry of farmers. She listened to foreign tongues as well: Hebrew, Aramaic, perhaps even Latin, though Rome's language was not her favourite. Later writers would claim she spoke as many as 9 languages, and though we cannot be certain, what we do know is this: she understood that words were bridges. Through them, she could cross divides that her ancestors had ignored. Can you imagine her, a young girl with dark, watchful eyes, listening intently to a tutor's lessons, then repeating phrases in the tongue of another land? Her voice, clear and deliberate, carried not just memory, but a spark of something deeper, a desire to belong, to weave together the worlds around her. Outside her lessons, the palace provided endless wonders. The halls were lined with mosaics, their tiles arranged in patterns of dolphins, vines, and swirling stars. Banquets were held in great chambers where golden lamps burned fragrant oil, and the sound of music echoed against marble walls. During festivals, barges sailed across the Nile decorated with flowers, while priests carried statues of gods in solemn procession. For a child, it was a life filled with beauty, yet always underlain with whispers. Those whispers were of politics, of alliances, of Rome. Cleopatra must have heard them even as she played in the gardens or watched the torches flicker in the hallways. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had paid dearly to keep his throne. Rome's senators expected Egypt to provide grain and riches in return, and discontent brewed among the people who felt their land was being drained to appease foreigners. For Cleopatra, the lesson came early. Power was never secure. It was always borrowed, bargained for, or defended. And then there was her family. Cleopatra was not her father's only child. She had sisters and brothers, each of whom might one day claim the throne. In the palace, siblings could be companions in play, but they could also become rivals. It was a strange duality, bonds of blood wrapped tightly with threads of suspicion. A laugh shared today could become a struggle for power tomorrow. Did Cleopatra sense this already as a child, as she walked through corridors with her brothers at her side? Perhaps she noticed the careful glances, the subtle pride, the small competitions over who could recite a lesson best or please a tutor most. Yet there were gentler moments too. Festivals when the city rejoiced, when musicians played and dancers spun in the torchlight. Times when Cleopatra, still small, would be lifted to see the great Pharos lighthouse burning its beacon into the night sky. Times when she might wander into the palace gardens, breathing in the fragrance of lotus blossoms, dipping her fingers into the cool marble basins of water. In such moments, she was simply a child, curious, playful, alive to the beauty around her. Her education, though, never strayed far from duty. Cleopatra was taught not only knowledge but presentation. She learned how to walk with grace, how to sit upon a throne with poise, how to speak so that every word carried weight. She was taught the rituals of the gods, the offerings of incense, the gestures of reverence. She studied medicine too, for in Egypt healing was as sacred as worship. The young princess knew the properties of herbs, the uses of honey and resin, the ways of treating wounds and easing fevers. It was said later that she kept her own collection of medical texts, a reminder that her mind was both scholarly and practical. In the evenings, the world softened. Lamps were lit, casting golden circles on the stone floors. Servants carried trays of figs, almonds, and wine. The sea air drifted in through the open courtyards, cool against the warmth of the day. Cleopatra may have sat with her tutors, reciting verses, or perhaps listened to her father play his flute, the notes rising gently into the night. Can you hear them? Soft, wavering, weaving through the silence, the music of a king who loved melody more than he loved politics. Even as a child, Cleopatra must have understood contrasts. Her father, indulgent yet insecure. Her family, wealthy yet divided. Her kingdom, splendid yet fragile. These dualities shaped her, teaching her to see the world not as simple, but layered. A lesson that would one day serve her well when she navigated Rome's storms and Egypt's survival. What did she dream of, this young girl in Alexandria? Did she imagine sailing down the Nile, the breeze lifting her hair as barges passed heavy with grain? Did she dream of gods who walked among mortals, or of heroes like those in Homer's tales? Did she, even then, dream of ruling? Perhaps she did. Or perhaps her dreams were simply of the night sky, the constellations gleaming over the city, the same stars her ancestors had watched for millennia. In the quiet moments of her youth, the seeds of her future were already being planted. Seeds of knowledge, of language, of connection. Seeds of resilience in the face of uncertainty. Seeds of ambition, though they may have been hidden even from herself. As we leave her now, still a child wandering marble halls and fragrant gardens, we carry with us the sense of a beginning. Cleopatra's story has not yet reached Exile, or Caesar, or Antony. For now, she is only a girl, learning, watching, absorbing the currents that swirl around her. But the palace in which she grows is no ordinary home. It is a place of both wonder and peril, a stage upon which her destiny is slowly being written, and beyond its walls, the world waits. Rome grows ever stronger. Egypt watches the Nile for its flood, and within the palace, whispers of succession stir. Soon those whispers will grow louder, drawing Cleopatra into the struggles of a family that was both her inheritance and her greatest challenge. The palace at Alexandria was never truly quiet. Even in the stillness of night, when the lamps burned low and the fountains whispered softly in the courtyards, there were always voices lingering in the shadows. Servants moved silently along polished floors, carrying trays of wine or messages sealed with wax. Courtiers lingered in hushed conversation, their words heavy with meaning. And somewhere beyond the marble columns, the sea's endless tide carried with it the sound of change. For Cleopatra, growing older meant awakening to these whispers. She had once wandered the palace as a child, entranced by its beauty. The mosaics glittering with dolphins, the gardens fragrant with lotus blossoms. But now, as she stepped into adolescence, she began to notice the currents beneath the surface. She saw how courtiers bowed lower before certain princes, how her father's musicians fell silent when senators from Rome appeared at court. She listened carefully when tutors spoke not only of history, but of the fragile balance between Egypt's independence and Rome's hunger. The Ptolemaic dynasty was a family bound by both blood and rivalry. Cleopatra had brothers and sisters, each with claims to power. In the royal court, sibling bonds were never simple. A sister could be a confidant one day, a rival the next. A brother could share a meal at the same table and, in time, share the throne or challenge it. This was the legacy of centuries of Ptolemaic tradition, where brothers married sisters, and co-rule was as dangerous as it was necessary. Her father, Ptolemy XII, held the throne, but not with ease. His dependence on Rome was plain to see. He paid heavy tribute to Roman generals and senators, draining Egypt's coffers to secure their support. For many Egyptians, this dependence felt like betrayal, a sign that their pharaoh no longer ruled as master of his land, but as a client of a foreign empire. In the streets of Alexandria, whispers rose of discontent. Cleopatra, still young, must have sensed the tension, the unease in her father's eyes, the way messages from Rome were received with both relief and dread. Inside the palace, these tensions deepened. Rivalries grew sharp, like the edges of a knife hidden beneath silk. Cleopatra's elder sisters, Berenice and Arsinoe, were ambitious. Her brothers, destined by custom to share the throne, were both allies and potential threats. Imagine her walking through the great halls, her steps echoing softly as she passed statues of pharaohs carved in stone. Their gazes seemed eternal, unchanging, yet all around her the air was alive with uncertainty. Intrigue lived in small gestures, a glance exchanged between courtiers, a sudden silence when a door opened, a letter arriving from Rome, its seal broken in secrecy before being presented to the king. Cleopatra, with her sharp mind and watchful eyes, learned to notice what others overlooked. She learned that silence often spoke louder than words, that loyalty was a fragile mask, and that knowledge, who said what, who favoured whom, was power. At banquets, she watched the way her father entertained Roman envoys, offering them not only gifts of gold, but Egypt's promise of grain, the harvests that kept Rome's people fed. She saw how carefully he measured his words, laughing when they laughed, flattering when they expected praise. Yet in private, he sighed deeply, his music the only place he could find refuge. For though he wore the crown of Egypt, he was trapped by obligations beyond its borders. The young princess could not escape these lessons. Even as she studied her scrolls, reciting verses of Homer or practicing the measured tones of rhetoric, she carried with her the awareness that her family lived in a house of glass. At any moment, a shift in Rome's favour, a quarrel among siblings, or a spark of rebellion in Alexandria could shatter everything. Whispers filled the palace corridors. Some said the people longed for a ruler strong enough to free Egypt from Rome's grasp. Others murmured that alliances with Rome were Egypt's only salvation. Still others spoke of betrayal, of daughters who might rise against fathers, of brothers who might usurp sisters. In such an atmosphere, trust was rare. Cleopatra, even in her youth, understood this. She trusted her own mind, her own ability to listen and observe. Can you imagine the tension of those evenings? A banquet lit by golden lamps, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine. Musicians playing their lyres, the notes drifting through the warm night. Courtiers dressed in silks, their laughter bright but brittle, their words chosen with care. And beneath it all, the silence of suspicion, each guest wondering who might rise higher, who might fall, and who might hold the ear of the king. Cleopatra's sisters, particularly Berenice, offered sharp reminders of how dangerous these rivalries could be. Berenice once seized the throne herself when their father was driven into exile, proving that the blood of the Ptolemies could turn against itself without hesitation. Though Cleopatra was still young during this tumult, the memory of it lingered. She saw in Berenice's rise and fall both the peril of ambition and the possibility it offered. Through it all, she cultivated her own gifts quietly, her intelligence, her languages, her poise. She grew into a young woman who could move through these halls not only as a daughter of the dynasty, but as someone who could command respect with her words. While others schemed openly, she prepared silently. She became, even in her youth, a figure who listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words carried weight. The palace itself seemed to breathe with these rivalries. Its walls had witnessed centuries of struggles, and its halls carried echoes of voices long gone. The mosaics on the floors, the statues in the gardens, the painted columns, all were reminders of power's beauty and fragility. And in the stillness of night, when torches flickered low, Cleopatra may have wandered those corridors, her thoughts as restless as the sea beyond the harbour walls. Outside the palace, the city mirrored these tensions. Alexandria was a place of wonders. The great Pharos lighthouse, the sprawling library, the bustling marketplaces where spices from Arabia and ivory from Africa changed hands. But it was also a city divided, where Greek settlers, Egyptian natives, and foreign merchants lived side by side, not always in harmony. The people felt the weight of their rulers' alliances with Rome, and their murmurs of discontent grew louder each year. For Cleopatra, the whispers of power became as familiar as the sound of the Nile. She grew up hearing them in the background of every lesson, every banquet, every procession. They were the rhythm of her world, shaping her understanding of leadership. She knew that to rule was not simply to sit upon a throne, but to survive storms of rivalry, to hold the loyalty of both people and allies, and to balance between the demands of Egypt and the shadow of Rome. As she stepped further into her youth, Cleopatra's awareness sharpened. She saw not only the weaknesses of her father's reign, but the opportunities that lay before her. The court was a dangerous place, but it was also a place where intelligence could triumph, where words could be wielded like swords, where alliances could be made in whispers. And so, the child of the palace became something more. A young woman shaped by intrigue, learning to move with grace through corridors filled with rivalry, learning that survival meant vigilance, and that power was never freely given, but always earned. The whispers would only grow louder in the years to come. Soon, they would swell into open conflict, into exile and return, into alliances with men who shaped the fate of empires. But for now, in these early days, Cleopatra was still listening, still learning, still walking softly among the marble halls, her future already forming in the shadows. The year was 51 BCE. The summer sun blazed over Alexandria, filling the palace courtyards with the scent of warmed stone and blooming jasmine. Yet behind the cool marble walls, the kingdom was in mourning. Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's father, had died. His reign, marked by debts to Rome and uneasy compromises, had come to an end. In the hush that followed his passing, eyes turned to his children and to the future of Egypt. By tradition, the throne was not meant for one alone. The Ptolemaic dynasty often paired brother with sister, binding their bloodline together in both marriage and co-rule. And so it was declared that Cleopatra, now about 18 years old, would share the throne with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was still little more than a boy. Their names were inscribed together on official decrees. Coins were minted showing both faces. To the world, they were rulers side by side, heirs of a dynasty stretching back to Alexander's general. Yet from the first, the balance was uneasy. Cleopatra was no passive queen. Her education, her intelligence, and her determination marked her as a ruler in her own right. She appeared before the people as pharaoh, not merely as consort. Unlike many of her ancestors, she spoke in the language of Egypt. She stood before temples in Memphis and Heliopolis, presenting herself not only as Ptolemaic queen, but as the daughter of Isis, beloved of the gods. The people listened. They heard in her words something her forebears had long denied them: respect, familiarity, connection. But her brother was surrounded by advisors who saw in Cleopatra's strength a threat to their influence. Chief among them was Pothinus, the regent, who sought to guide the young king and through him to control Egypt. To such men, Cleopatra's independence was intolerable. They whispered that she sought to rule alone, that she disregarded her brother's rights. The court, already accustomed to intrigue, became a stage for new rivalries. Imagine the palace in those days. By day, audiences filled the halls, where nobles, priests, and envoys came to seek the ruler's favor. Cleopatra sat tall upon her throne, her gaze steady, her words clear. She listened with patience, weighed matters with careful thought, and gave commands with quiet authority. At her side, her younger brother, still learning, relied on the counsel of those who whispered in his ear. The air between them, once perhaps warm with sibling closeness, grew cool with distance. At night, the palace hummed with schemes. Advisors met in candlelit chambers, their voices low. Letters were dispatched in secrecy. The young king was persuaded that his sister overshadowed him, that his place was being stolen. And so, step by step, the partnership unraveled. By 49 BCE, the rift could no longer be concealed. Cleopatra, still only in her late teens, found herself driven from the palace. Her brother's faction seized control, and she slipped into exile. Imagine her leaving Alexandria, the city where she had been born, where the lighthouse still blazed across the harbour. The streets she knew so well fell behind her, the torches of the palace dwindling in the night. Yet she was not defeated. Exile, for Cleopatra, was not an end but a gathering of strength. Beyond Egypt's borders, she sought allies. In Syria, she raised troops, appealing to those who still believed in her claim. It must have been a strange, humbling moment. The princess, who had once studied beneath marble columns, now negotiating with soldiers, securing provisions, preparing to march. Yet there was resolve in her. She had learned from the whispers of power that survival meant adaptation. And so she adapted, trading silks for armor, the rhythms of lessons for the cadence of military commands. Back in Alexandria, her brother's court celebrated their triumph. Pothinus and his allies believed they had secured their hold on power, but the Nile itself seemed to whisper otherwise. For the river was Egypt's lifeline, and Cleopatra's bond with the people had not been so easily broken. Farmers and priests remembered her words in their own tongue. Merchants recalled her fairness in judgment. While the palace echoed with the voices of her rivals, the streets carried a quieter loyalty. Can you picture her then, camped with her supporters in the desert night? The fire flickering, casting shadows on the sands. Her gaze lifted to the stars, the same constellations she had studied as a child. She must have felt the weight of her father's legacy, the fragility of her dynasty, and yet within her burned a determination stronger than exile. She was not merely a princess displaced, she was a queen awaiting her return. It was during this time of exile that fate itself shifted. For in Rome, civil war was tearing the Republic apart. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies, now clashed for supremacy. Their struggle would spill into Egypt, drawing Cleopatra back into the palace she had lost. But before Caesar arrived, before destiny entwined their fates, Cleopatra had to endure the uncertainty of displacement. She relied on her wits, on the loyalty she inspired, and on the knowledge that Egypt's story was not yet finished without her. Each day in exile sharpened her resilience. Each night by the fire honed her resolve. The struggle with her brother was not only a fight for the throne, it was a crucible in which Cleopatra's character was tested. She had already learned to listen to whispers, to see the hidden daggers in smiles. Now she learned endurance, patience, and the art of waiting for the right moment. Her brother, guided by ambitious regents, may have thought he had triumphed, but Cleopatra was already planning her return. And so, the palace in Alexandria remained alive with rivalry. Its walls, which had heard centuries of intrigue, now echoed with the voices of a brother and sister turned opponents. The mosaic still shone beneath the torchlight, the garden still bloomed, the fountains still murmured, but beneath their beauty, tension coiled tight. The throne of Egypt, shared in name, had become a prize of division. As the Nile flowed on, carrying barges heavy with grain to the harbours, as priests lit incense in temples where the gods' statues glowed in golden lamplight, the fate of Egypt itself hung in the balance. And far away in the deserts and borderlands, Cleopatra gathered strength, her eyes fixed on Alexandria, her heart bound to the city that was hers by birth and destiny. The struggle for the throne had begun. And in the quiet hours of night, beneath the same stars that had watched over Pharaohs for millennia, Egypt waited for the moment when queen and brother would meet again, not as siblings, but as rivals in the game of power. The desert has a silence unlike any other. At night, beneath the vast dome of stars, the world feels both infinite and empty. The wind drifts softly over the dunes, carrying with it the faint cry of an owl, the shuffle of a camel's feet, the creak of leather straps. It was in this silence, far from the marble halls of Alexandria, that Cleopatra found herself after being cast out of her own kingdom. She was only in her late teens, yet already she had known the heights of royal power and the sting of betrayal. Her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, guided by his regent Pothinus and other advisors, now sat in Alexandria's palace, wearing the crown that should have been shared. Cleopatra, driven from her home, faced the endless stretch of desert and the daunting task of survival. Exile could have been her undoing. Many before her had faded into obscurity when stripped of court and crown. But Cleopatra was different. From childhood, she had absorbed the lessons of her dynasty, that power was fragile, that fortune turned quickly, and that survival belonged to those who could adapt. In exile, she did not despair. She began to plan. Her first refuge was in Syria, a land of bustling cities and arid landscapes, where merchants and soldiers passed along the great trade routes that bound east and west. Here, Cleopatra sought allies. She appealed to governors and commanders, reminding them of Egypt's wealth, its grain, its strategic power. Her words, spoken in languages many of her rivals could not master, carried conviction. Slowly, she gathered support. Soldiers rallied to her cause. Mercenaries offered their swords. Supplies were secured, and an army began to take shape. Can you picture her then? A young woman, once seated in gilded halls, now standing beneath a desert tent lit by oil lamps, maps spread before her, voices murmuring strategies. Dust clung to her sandals, the night wind tugged at her cloak. Yet her gaze remained steady, her voice calm. She was learning a new art, not only of ruling from a throne, but of commanding from exile. The desert taught her patience. Days passed in harsh sun, nights in sharp cold. The campfires flickered, surrounded by men who had once fought for other masters, but who now looked to her for guidance. Cleopatra, with her intelligence and poise, earned their loyalty. She did not shrink from the difficulties of exile, the long marches, the uncertain provisions, the endless waiting for opportunity. Instead, She adapted, just as she had adapted as a child to whispers in the palace. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, her brother's court believed her threat had passed. Pothinus and his circle reassured themselves that a young woman in exile could not challenge their power. But beyond their marble walls, the desert winds told another story. Cleopatra's resolve was strengthening, her following growing. Still, exile was not only about armies and alliances. It was also a time of solitude and reflection. Away from the constant noise of palace intrigue, Cleopatra could look inward. She remembered the halls of the library, the lessons of philosophers, the words of Homer. She remembered her father's music, the softness of the palace gardens, the scent of lotus blossoms drifting on warm breezes. All of it seemed distant now, like a dream she had once lived. And yet, these memories fueled her. They reminded her not only of what she had lost, but of what she would one day reclaim. On quiet nights, when the camp settled into sleep, she may have stepped outside her tent and looked up at the stars. The desert sky was vast, filled with constellations the Egyptians had charted for centuries. Orion, the hunter, rose above the horizon. The dog star glimmered bright. To her people, these stars were eternal guides, marking the cycles of the Nile, the seasons of planting and harvest. To Cleopatra, they must have been reminders of Egypt itself, timeless, enduring, waiting for her return. Exile also deepened her empathy. For the first time, perhaps, she experienced life not cushioned by palace luxury, but shaped by hardship. She walked among soldiers who ate simple bread and dates, who endured heat by day and chill by night. She saw the loyalty that grew not from bloodlines, but from trust. And she learned that a queen's power was not only in her crown, but in the respect she inspired, even in the most uncertain of times. The months passed, and the tension between Egypt and Rome grew ever tighter, for Rome itself was in turmoil. Julius Caesar and Pompey were locked in civil war, their battles reshaping the Mediterranean. Egypt, with its wealth and grain, was too valuable to be ignored. And soon, that struggle would spill onto Egyptian soil, altering Cleopatra's fate forever. But before that moment came, she remained in the desert, waiting, planning, watching. Her brother's court in Alexandria might believe her defeated, but Cleopatra knew that exile was not an end. It was a passage, a proving ground. Each hardship endured, each alliance forged, each soldier rallied brought her closer to the moment when she would return. Can you imagine the weight of those days? The long rides across barren plains, the wind whipping against her face, the endless horizon of sand, the clatter of armor in the camp, the murmurs of men around the fire, and within her a fire of her own, quiet, steady, unyielding. Exile gave her something that palace life never could: resilience. She learned to live without marble walls, without silken comforts, without the certainty of safety. She discovered the strength that comes not from inheritance, but from survival, and in that strength lay the foundation of the queen she would become. When she finally looked westward again, toward Egypt, the lighthouse of Alexandria seemed to burn brighter in her mind than ever before. The city was not yet lost. The Nile still flowed. The temples still rose, their columns carved with gods who had watched rulers rise and fall for millennia. Cleopatra knew she would return, and when she did, she would return not as a girl sheltered by palace gardens, but as a queen tempered by exile, sharpened by hardship, and prepared to face the storms ahead. The desert winds carried her resolve, and the stars bore witness. In time, fate itself would bring her back to Alexandria and into the path of Rome's most powerful man. But for now, in the hush of exile, Cleopatra waited, her story still gathering strength in the silence beyond the palace walls. The Mediterranean was restless. Waves rolled against the ships of Rome, their sails billowing with the winds of civil war. Julius Caesar, having crossed the Rubicon, had pursued his rival Pompey the Great across seas and continents. Their struggle shook the very foundations of the Roman Republic, and soon its tremors would be felt in Alexandria. In 48 BCE, Pompey, defeated at the Battle of Pharos, fled to Egypt. He sought refuge with young Ptolemy XIII, believing the boy king and his advisors would offer him safety. But Egypt, ever caught between survival and ambition, chose a darker course. Pothinus and his circle, eager to win Caesar's favor, ordered Pompey's assassination. As he stepped onto the Egyptian shore, Pompey was struck down, his body left lifeless in the surf. News of this act reached Caesar as he approached Alexandria. He had pursued Pompey across the sea, only to learn that his great rival had been killed not in battle, but by betrayal. The Roman general was said to have turned away in sorrow, for though Pompey had been his enemy, he had also been his son-in-law and once his ally. To Caesar, Egypt had offered not loyalty, but treachery. And so Caesar entered Alexandria with caution, his legions behind him, his gaze sharp. The city that had stood as a beacon of learning and beauty now bristled with tension. Its streets were alive with murmurs of Rome's power, of the young king's fragile rule, of the queen in exile who still claimed her throne. Cleopatra, in her camp beyond Egypt's borders, heard of Caesar's arrival. To her, it was more than news. It was opportunity. Rome's most powerful man now stood in the palace where her brother ruled. And Caesar, though victorious, was also weary of betrayal. If she could reach him, if she could win his favor, she might yet reclaim what was hers. But entering Alexandria was no simple task. Pothinus and his allies watched closely, wary of her return. To appear openly at the palace would mean arrest, perhaps even death. Cleopatra needed cunning. And so, legend tells us, she devised a plan that would echo through the centuries. Picture the night. The lamps of Alexandria flickered along narrow streets. The sea air carried salt and the cry of gulls. Through the shadows, Cleopatra's small entourage approached the palace. She was concealed, hidden within a sack or rug, carried by a loyal servant. Step by step, the bundle passed beneath the watchful eyes of guards, through the grand gates, into the chambers where Caesar awaited. When the coverings were unrolled, there she was, Cleopatra, radiant despite exile, her presence commanding even in secrecy. Caesar, seasoned and shrewd, looked upon her not merely as a fugitive queen, but as a woman of intelligence and daring. In that moment, an alliance began, one born not only of necessity, but of admiration. Can you imagine the scene? The Roman general, weathered by campaigns across Gaul and civil war, facing the young Egyptian queen, whose gaze carried both resilience and grace. The room around them lit by oil lamps, the scent of incense lingering in the air, the marble floors cool beneath their feet. Two worlds, two powers, meeting in a single chamber. Cleopatra spoke, not as a supplicant, but as a queen. She presented her case clearly. She had been cast out unjustly, her brother manipulated by corrupt regents. Egypt needed stability, and she alone could provide it. Caesar, whose mind weighed politics as carefully as strategy, listened. Egypt's grain was vital to Rome. Its ports commanded the Mediterranean. Supporting Cleopatra could secure Rome's interests as much as hers. Their alliance was sealed not only in politics, but in companionship. Caesar admired her intellect, her wit, her command of languages. Cleopatra saw in him the strength of Rome, the possibility of reclaiming her throne. And so, beneath the vaulted ceilings of Alexandria's palace, a partnership was forged. But outside those walls, the city stirred with unrest. Pothinus and his faction saw in Caesar's support of Cleopatra a threat to their power. Crowds gathered in the streets, soldiers muttered in the barracks. The palace, once a place of luxury, became a fortress, its halls echoing not with music, but with the tramp of Roman boots. Cleopatra, though restored to the palace, was not yet secure. Her brother's forces, loyal to his advisors, began to resist. The city trembled with the clash of factions, Alexandrian soldiers against Roman legions, palace intrigue spilling into open conflict. For a time, Caesar and Cleopatra found themselves besieged within the very walls that had once housed feasts and festivals. Still, within that turmoil, a bond grew. Cleopatra, no longer the exiled queen wandering deserts, now stood side by side with Rome's greatest general. She had risked everything to reach him, and in return, she found not only protection, but opportunity. The whispers that had once filled the palace now carried her name in tones of awe and suspicion. At night, when the din of the city softened, Cleopatra may have walked the palace corridors with Caesar at her side. Together, they would have spoken of politics, of Rome and Egypt, of the uncertain future. Oil lamps flickered against painted columns, casting their shadows long across the stone. Beyond the windows, the harbour shimmered under moonlight, the great Pharos lighthouse sending its beacon far into the sea. What did she feel in those nights? Relief at her return, perhaps. Determination to secure her throne. Curiosity at the man who had become her ally. For though their story has been told many times, often through the lens of romance, what cannot be denied is the shared ambition that bound them. Each saw in the other not only power, but possibility. Yet Alexandria was not easily tamed. The struggles within its walls would soon demand more than whispered alliances. Caesar, caught between loyalty to Rome and the turmoil of Egypt, would be drawn deeper into conflict. And Cleopatra, standing beside him, would see her throne defended not only by her words, but by Roman steel. The arrival of Caesar had changed everything. The exiled queen was now returned to the palace. The boy king, once secure, now faced the might of Rome. And Egypt, ever caught between foreign powers and its own dynastic rivalries, stood at the edge of transformation. The Nile flowed on, steady as always, bearing witness to yet another turning of fortune. In its reflection, the stars gleamed, eternal above the shifting struggles of men and women, and in the palace of Alexandria, beneath those same stars, Cleopatra and Caesar began the chapter of her life that would alter history itself. The palace of Alexandria no longer echoed with only music and feasts. Its marble corridors now rang with the footsteps of Roman soldiers, their armour glinting in torchlight. Outside, the city simmered with unrest, its people divided between loyalty to the young King Ptolemy XIII and the queen who had returned from exile. Within these walls, Cleopatra and Julius Caesar stood side by side, bound by necessity, their futures entwined by the shifting tides of history. The boy king's advisors, led by Pothinus, had hoped to use Rome to their advantage. They had welcomed Caesar with the blood of Pompey, believing they had secured his favour. Instead, their treachery had earned only Caesar's disdain. The general would not be swayed by betrayal, and when Cleopatra appeared before him, hidden and daring, he chose to recognize her claim. To Caesar, supporting her was not only a matter of justice, but of strategy. Egypt's grain, its wealth, its position on the Mediterranean, all were prizes Rome could not ignore. But Caesar's presence alone could not settle the throne. Pothinus and his allies refused to yield. The city turned into a battlefield. Streets that had once carried merchants and scholars now shook with the clash of steel. Roman legions held the palace, but Alexandrian forces rallied around Ptolemy XIII. Siege lines formed. Supplies grew scarce. The queen and the general, though united, found themselves trapped within the very heart of Alexandria. Picture the palace during those tense days. The courtyards where fountains once sparkled, now filled with the sound of soldiers sharpening swords. The banquet halls, once filled with laughter and music, became council chambers where strategies were whispered late into the night. Cleopatra moved through these halls with calm poise, her presence reminding all who served that Egypt's queen was no longer absent, no longer silent. She was here, holding her throne not with ceremony, but with resilience. Caesar, though seasoned by years of war in Gaul and civil conflict in Rome, faced challenges unlike any before. The Alexandrian harbour, with its labyrinth of canals and ships, became the stage for fierce clashes. Fire spread across the docks, flames rising high into the night as wooden vessels burned. The sea itself reflected the fury of the struggle, waves glowing orange beneath the blaze. And through it all, Cleopatra remained at Caesar's side. She watched, she listened, she learned. This was no longer the exile who had once wandered deserts, uncertain of her return. This was a queen standing firm, her survival tied to the outcome of battles raging beyond the palace walls. Yet even in the midst of conflict, there were moments of quiet, moments where history whispers of something more than politics. Caesar, nearly 30 years her senior, was a man shaped by conquest, by ambition, by a mind that saw strategy in every movement. Cleopatra, still in her early 20s, was brilliant, bold, and unafraid. Their conversations, lit by the glow of oil lamps, must have carried both urgency and curiosity. She, fluent in many tongues, with knowledge of philosophy and science, could match him in wit. He, with the weight of Rome on his shoulders, found in her a companion unlike any he had known. Was it love? Was it alliance? Or was it both, tangled together in the way history so often binds hearts and power? The scrolls of historians differ, their accounts coloured by admiration or disdain. Yet what is certain is that Cleopatra and Caesar became inseparable in those days of siege. Their destinies flowing together like two rivers, meeting at last. The Alexandrian War raged on. At one point, Caesar himself was nearly trapped, forced to leap into the sea to escape, swimming to safety through waters heavy with the weight of armour. His survival was as much fortune as skill, and still the struggle continued, until reinforcements from Rome arrived to tip the balance. At last, the young king's forces were broken. Ptolemy XIII, in flight, drowned in the Nile, the very river that had nourished Egypt, now claiming one of its rulers. With his death, the path cleared. Cleopatra, restored by Caesar's support, was once again Queen of Egypt. Yet she did not rule alone. As tradition demanded, she was paired with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. Though in truth her authority far outweighed his. Her throne was secure, but it was secured through her alliance with Rome. Can you imagine her feelings in that moment? Standing upon the palace balcony, the harbour stretching before her, the lighthouse blazing its eternal fire. The sounds of victory still echoing in the city, the smoke of battle lingering in the air. She had returned, not as a fugitive, but as Pharaoh. The whispers that had once sought to silence her now carried her name with awe. And yet she knew her reign was now bound to the will of Caesar. For the Roman general too, the victory was significant. Egypt was stable, its grain secure, its queen an ally. But more than that, he had found in Cleopatra a partner who matched his ambition, his intellect, his daring. Together, they celebrated their survival, their triumph, and the strange, unexpected bond that had grown in the midst of war. The Nile flowed on, as it always had, carrying barges heavy with harvest, its waters gleaming beneath the sun. And upon its banks, Cleopatra and Caesar began a new chapter. Their union was not yet the story of Rome and Egypt intertwined, not yet the tale that would bring forth a child named Caesarion. But its foundation had been laid. The river had carried Cleopatra from childhood to exile, from exile to return, and now from survival to triumph. The Rubicon, once crossed by Caesar, had changed Rome forever, and in Alexandria, his meeting with Cleopatra had begun to change the fate of Egypt. Two worlds had met, the river of Egypt and the Rubicon of Rome, and their currents now flowed together, carrying queen and general alike toward a destiny greater than either could yet foresee. The city of Alexandria stirred with new life. Its streets, scarred by months of conflict, began to hum again with the sound of merchants calling their wares, the creak of carts along the marble-paved avenues, and the laughter of children chasing one another near the harbour. Smoke had once risen from battle-scorched docks, but now sails filled the horizon, ships carrying grain, spices, and papyrus once more. The city breathed again, though beneath its surface, the memory of war lingered like an echo. At the heart of this revival stood Cleopatra, no longer the exiled queen wandering desert camps, no longer the fugitive smuggled into a palace rolled within cloth. She now stood openly, visibly, upon her throne. The Alexandrian War had ended with the death of her brother Ptolemy XIII, claimed by the Nile during his flight. With him, the regents who had conspired to deny her rule were gone. And in their place, Cleopatra had emerged not only restored, but transformed. A queen seasoned by struggle, tempered by exile, and strengthened by alliance. By tradition, she could not rule alone. A new co-ruler was named, her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, still a boy and no real rival. His name appeared beside hers on decrees, his face minted alongside hers on coins. Yet all who looked upon the throne understood the truth. Cleopatra was Egypt's sovereign, in fact, as well as in form. Her first task was to restore stability to a kingdom frayed by division. Grain stores had been disrupted by war, debts to Rome weighed heavily on the treasury, and the loyalty of the people, though warmed by her command of their language, still required careful tending. Cleopatra moved quickly. She re-established order in the courts, ensured the temples resumed their rituals, and restored the rhythms of festivals that reminded her people of continuity and hope. She travelled along the Nile, appearing before the priests of ancient shrines, dressed not only in the Greek robes of her dynasty, but in the linen garb of the Pharaohs. She offered incense to Isis, stood in solemn procession, and declared herself not merely queen by inheritance, but pharaoh by the favour of the gods. Can you imagine those journeys? Barges drifting down the Nile, their sails catching the desert wind. Musicians playing flutes and drums as the Queen's vessel approached, its prow gilded with sunlight. Crowds gathered along the banks, their voices rising in cheers, their arms lifted in reverence. For many, it was the first time they had seen their ruler in years, and now she spoke to them in their own tongue, her words flowing like the river itself. In her presence, they saw not a distant monarch, but a living daughter of Egypt. Beside her, though often in shadow, stood Julius Caesar. The Roman general did not linger in Egypt only as an observer. His presence was both assurance and reminder. For Cleopatra, his support had restored her throne. For Caesar, Egypt was too valuable to abandon quickly. The city's harbours teemed with grain, the lifeblood of Rome, and its queen was a steadfast ally. Their partnership, forged in siege and survival, deepened in these months of calm. Cleopatra's intelligence, her mastery of languages, her quick wit and charm captivated Caesar. He, seasoned by decades of command, found in her a ruler who matched ambition with grace. Their companionship became both personal and political, a bond that altered the course of two empires. Yet Cleopatra was careful. She knew the eyes of Alexandria and of Rome, watched closely. To her people, she presented herself foremost as pharaoh, a ruler sanctified by gods, defender of Egypt's traditions. Her processions were rich with Egyptian symbolism, golden statues borne aloft, priests in white linen chanting hymns, incense thick in the air. To Rome, she presented herself as ally and partner, her loyalty pledged through Caesar. She balanced these identities with care, weaving them together as one would weave reeds into a single strong basket. The palace itself reflected this new era. Where once its halls had echoed with whispers of rivalry, now they filled with the rhythm of administration. Scribes bent over papyrus scrolls, their reeds scratching ink onto parchment as decrees were recorded. Messengers hurried through marble corridors, carrying orders sealed with Cleopatra's name. Scholars returned to the libraries, restoring the hum of study and debate. In the gardens, roses and jasmine bloomed again, their fragrance carried on the sea breeze. But the greatest symbol of renewal was not palace nor temple. It was Cleopatra herself. The young queen walked with a new assurance, her voice carrying not only the authority of lineage, but the strength of survival. She had faced exile, war, and betrayal, and had returned not diminished, but elevated. Her presence was both reassurance and reminder. Egypt had a ruler who could endure. At night, when the business of rule subsided, Cleopatra and Caesar may have spoken in quieter tones. Perhaps they sat in a colonnade overlooking the sea, the lamps casting soft light on the waves. Perhaps they shared thoughts on empire, on philosophy, on the uncertain tides of fate. Caesar, who had crossed the Rubicon and reshaped Rome, now spoke with the queen who had braved exile and reclaimed Egypt. Two leaders, bound by both necessity and affinity, gazed out over a horizon where their futures converged. Yet not all in Alexandria welcomed this bond. Some whispered that Cleopatra's closeness to Caesar tied Egypt too tightly to Rome. Others, recalling the betrayal of Pompey, looked upon Romans with suspicion. And in Rome itself, Caesar's enemies would later seize upon this relationship, using it to cast him as a man ensnared by a foreign queen. For now, though, in the warm glow of Alexandria, the partnership seemed strong. Cleopatra did not ignore these murmurs. She had grown up listening to whispers in palace halls, and she knew the weight of rumor. But she also knew that appearances mattered, and so she continued to walk in procession as Pharaoh, to speak in Egyptian to her people, to remind them that she was not merely a consort of Rome, but their queen, their protector, their living link to the gods. Can you imagine the sight of her seated in the palace audience chamber, the marble floors gleaming, the columns painted with lotus and papyrus? She, adorned in golden diadem and linen robes, sat upon a throne shaped in the likeness of Horus's falcon. Courtiers and envoys bowed low, the scent of incense drifting upward. When she spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate, commanding, the voice of a woman who had learned from exile and from war that every word must carry weight. And so Egypt settled, slowly, into peace. The scars of conflict remained, but beneath them, life resumed. Farmers sowed their fields along the Nile. Merchants once again filled Alexandria's markets with spices, oils, and silks. Priests lit lamps before the statues of gods, their hymns echoing in stone temples. And at the center of it all, Cleopatra reigned, her throne restored, her vision clear. She knew, however, that peace was never permanent. Rome's shadow stretched across the Mediterranean, and her alliance with Caesar bound her fate to his. But for now, in these years of renewal, she savored the stability she had reclaimed, the chance to rule, to strengthen Egypt, to prepare for what lay ahead. The Nile flowed on, golden in the sun, silver in the moonlight, carrying barges heavy with grain toward the sea. And on its banks, Cleopatra stood once more as queen, her reign restored, her story far from complete. For soon, from this restoration, a new chapter would emerge, one that carried not only the fate of Egypt, but the legacy of a child yet to be born. The Nile was heavy with the green of summer when the news spread through Alexandria. The queen had given birth. In the palace, where marble floors gleamed beneath painted ceilings, where courtyards bloomed with roses and fountains whispered beneath the heat, the cry of a newborn rang out. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, had born a son. The child was named Ptolemy the 15th Philopator Philometor Caesar. But to the world and to history, he would be known simply as Caesarion, Little Caesar. For Cleopatra, his birth was more than a mother's joy. It was a promise, a living legacy. In her arms, she held not only a child, but the hope of her dynasty, the bridge between Egypt and Rome. His tiny hands curled as though clutching threads of destiny, his dark eyes bright with the spark of new life. She, who had walked the corridors of power since girlhood, who had faced exile and returned, now gazed upon her son and saw both her greatest triumph and her greatest gamble. Caesarion's father was Julius Caesar, Rome's most powerful man. Though he never publicly declared the child his heir, Cleopatra made no secret of the connection. She believed Caesarion bound her throne to the might of Rome, giving Egypt not only security but prestige. In the eyes of her people, she had given them a pharaoh who carried the blood of their queen and the lineage of Rome's conqueror. To her, this was divine providence. The gods themselves had sanctioned her line. Can you imagine the palace in those days? The hush of servants moving softly, carrying bowls of milk and honey. The scent of lotus drifting through open windows. Cleopatra, seated beneath the shade of columns, cradling her infant while tutors recited hymns to Isis, the goddess of motherhood. Musicians may have played lullabies on flutes, their notes floating gently through the air. And all the while, the queen's gaze remained fixed on her son, her Caesarion, her promise of continuity. But beneath the tenderness of motherhood lay the currents of politics. Rome was far away, yet ever present. Julius Caesar, though bound to Cleopatra in affection and alliance, remained married to Calpurnia in Rome. The Roman Senate watched him warily, their suspicion of his growing power sharpened by whispers of his Egyptian queen and her child. To them, Caesarion was not only a boy, he was a question, a challenge. Could he ever be recognized? Would Caesar dare to name him his heir? Or would this child become a shadow in Rome's history, denied by politics, cherished only in Egypt? Cleopatra understood these questions well. She had grown up among whispers, among rivalries, among the fragile balance of dynasties. She knew that Caesarion's existence would not be welcomed by all. Yet she also knew that his birth gave her something no rival could claim. A connection to Caesar himself, the man who had restored her throne. And so she crafted his image with care. Caesarion was not merely her son, he was Egypt's child. In temple rituals, priests invoked his name beside hers, presenting him as divine, the living Horus beside the goddess Isis. In processions, she held him before the people, his tiny form wrapped in linen embroidered with gold. Crowds cheered, seeing in him not only a royal infant, but the promise of a future pharaoh who carried the blood of two great worlds. The symbolism was powerful. In Egyptian belief, kingship was rebirth, each new ruler a continuation of the god's will. By presenting Caesarion as both son of Caesar and son of Isis, Cleopatra wove myth and politics into a single thread. She declared that Egypt's future lay not in division, but in union, a union sanctified by both earthly power and divine favor. Yet not all were convinced. In Rome, Caesar's enemies whispered that Cleopatra sought to enthrall him, to use her son to bind Rome beneath Egypt's influence. They mocked the notion of little Caesar, dismissing him as illegitimate, a pawn of a foreign queen. Even Caesar himself, cautious of Rome's politics, never named Caesarion his successor. Instead, he placed his ambitions in Rome, where he moved steadily toward dictatorship. For Cleopatra, however, Caesarion was no shadow. He was her joy, her reason, her hope. Imagine her in the quiet of night, the palace stilled, the torches dimmed. She leans over her child, brushing her lips against his forehead, whispering prayers in Egyptian, prayers for strength, for wisdom, for the protection of gods older than empires. The weight of rulership, the burden of alliances, the dangers of Rome, all fell away in those moments. There was only mother and child, heart against heart, breath against breath. The years of his infancy passed in relative calm. Cleopatra ruled with growing confidence, her throne secure, her bond with Caesar steady. She expanded Egypt's wealth, ensured temples flourished, and strengthened her image as pharaoh. Caesar visited her in Alexandria, and for a time, their lives intertwined in both governance and companionship. Together they sailed the Nile, its waters carrying their barge past temples and villages. Crowds gathered along the banks to glimpse their queen beside Rome's general, their voices rising in cheers. For the people of Egypt, this was more than spectacle. It was reassurance. Their queen was powerful, her alliance strong, their future bright. Yet the world beyond Egypt stirred. In Rome, Caesar's star rose higher and higher, and with it, envy and fear grew among his rivals. His bond with Cleopatra, his rumoured child, his ambitions, all added to the tension. For while Egypt basked in stability, Rome edged toward upheaval. Cleopatra, ever watchful, must have felt the tremors even from afar. She knew that Caesarion's future was fragile, tied not only to Egypt's prosperity, but to Caesar's survival. Still, she presented her son with unwavering devotion, never doubting that he was destined for greatness. She envisioned him as Pharaoh, as the continuation of her dynasty, as the child who would carry Egypt into an age beyond her own. The Nile flowed, steady and eternal, as seasons turned. Caesarion grew, his laughter filling palace chambers, his tiny feet pattering across mosaic floors. Cleopatra's heart swelled with each moment, yet in the quiet recesses of her mind, she could not silence the question that lingered like a shadow. Would the world allow her son to inherit the promise she saw so clearly? For now, she chose to believe. She chose to weave hope into each day, to hold Caesarion close, and let the gods decide what lay ahead. He was her child, her heir, her living bond with both Egypt and Rome. In his birth, she had gained more than a son. She had gained a symbol, a fragile, precious flame that could illuminate the future or be extinguished by the storms of empire. And so, under the watch of the stars, Cleopatra rocked her son to sleep, his breath soft against her skin. The queen who had endured exile and war, who had reclaimed her throne and secured her rule, now faced her greatest test of all: to nurture a legacy in a world where nothing was certain, where every gift carried its own peril, and where even the cry of a newborn could shake the foundations of empires. The palace in Alexandria shimmered in the golden light of dawn. The Nile, steady as ever, carried barges heavy with grain down to the harbours. In those years after Caesarion's birth, Egypt seemed to breathe with a rhythm of calm. Cleopatra's throne was secure, her bond with Caesar strong, her people reassured by her presence in temples and festivals. Yet beyond Egypt's borders, in the heart of Rome, the winds of change gathered. Julius Caesar's star had risen higher than any Roman before him. He had defeated his rivals, secured power as dictator, and reshaped the republic into something new, something many feared was becoming monarchy in all but name. For his enemies, his greatness was too great, his ambition too bold. In whispers, in secret meetings, in chambers lit by lamplight, men plotted against him. Cleopatra, far away, could not ignore these tremors. She had bound her future, and her son's future, to Caesar. Rome was not merely an ally, it was the foundation upon which her restored reign now rested. And so, when Caesar invited her to Rome, she went. Imagine the journey, her royal barge cutting through the waters of the Mediterranean, its sails bright against the sky. Servants moved swiftly across the decks, the scent of salt and resin mingling in the air. At her side, Caesarion, her child, the living symbol of two worlds. And as the harbours of Rome drew near, the city revealed itself not in marble peace, but in restless grandeur. Rome was unlike Alexandria, where Alexandria dazzled with order, marble, and the light of the sea. Rome was vast and crowded, its streets alive with voices in countless accents. Temples rose high, their columns weathered but proud. The Forum bustled with senators, merchants, and soldiers. Chariots rattled over cobblestones. For Cleopatra, it must have been both astonishing and unsettling. A city that commanded the world, yet carried within it the cracks of discord. She was housed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, away from the Senate's heart, but close enough to remind all of her presence. Crowds whispered of her beauty, her intellect, her daring. To many Romans, she was a fascination. The Queen of Egypt, foreign yet regal, walking with grace through the city's gardens, her child at her side. To others, she was a threat, a reminder that Caesar's heart might not belong to Rome alone. Can you imagine the whispers? Senators watching as Caesar walked beside her. Roman matrons casting furtive glances, their voices low. Soldiers debating whether their general's loyalty could be divided. Cleopatra bore it all with composure. She had been raised among whispers, had survived exile and siege. Rome's curiosity and suspicion were no more daunting than the courts of Alexandria. For a time, her presence was a marvel. Caesar unveiled plans for a grand public works program, including the transformation of the Forum and even the rebuilding of Rome in marble. He honored Cleopatra, treating her not as a guest, but as a queen. Yet the Senate's unease deepened. For all his triumphs, Caesar's ambition frightened them. And in the presence of Cleopatra and Caesarion, some saw a vision they could not tolerate. A dynasty born not of Rome, but of Egypt. Then came the Ides of March. The day dawned with the ordinary hum of Rome. Senators prepared for meetings. Merchants opened their stalls. The streets filled with the shuffle of sandals. Cleopatra, perhaps in her villa, perhaps walking gardens with her child, could not have known that the world was about to change. In the Senate house, as Caesar took his place, the whispers of conspiracy became action. Surrounded by men he had once trusted, he was struck down. The details, the daggers, the blows, the cry of betrayal, were carried by rumour and report. But to Cleopatra, what mattered was only this. The man who had restored her throne, the father of her child, the anchor of her alliance, was gone. The news must have reached her like a shadow falling suddenly across the sun. One moment, her future was bright with certainty. The next, it was veiled in doubt. Caesar was dead. Rome was in chaos. And she was a foreign queen, standing in a city that no longer offered her safety. Imagine her heart in that moment. The palace gardens, filled with spring blossoms, seemed suddenly colder. The laughter of her son, Caesarion, must have pierced her like both comfort and sorrow. For now, he carried not only her hope, but the weight of his father's absence. Cleopatra, who had once looked upon Caesar as ally, protector, and partner, now faced the world alone once more. She did not linger in Rome. With haste, she returned to Egypt, the barge carrying her and Caesarion back across the Mediterranean. Behind her, Rome descended into turmoil. Rival factions, bitter speeches, the struggle for succession. Ahead of her lay Alexandria, where the Nile still flowed, steady and eternal, indifferent to the storms of foreign lands. Yet Cleopatra carried with her more than grief. She carried determination. Caesar was gone, but his memory remained, and in Caesarion she held proof of their bond. She declared him her co-ruler, her son Pharaoh beside her, presented to her people as the living continuation of both Egyptian and Roman greatness. Statues were raised, coins minted, ceremonies performed, all to show that Egypt's throne was secure. But deep within, Cleopatra must have known the truth. Caesarion's future was fragile. Rome would not easily accept him, and without Caesar's protection, her bond with the Republic was weakened. She stood once again in the place she had known so often, a queen on the edge of uncertainty, her throne solid yet shadowed, her future bound to powers beyond her control. Still, she did not falter. She resumed her reign with dignity, guiding Egypt through the turbulence of the years that followed. She walked in processions, offered incense to the gods, spoke to her people in their tongue. She reminded them, and herself, that Egypt's heart was strong, even if Rome's storms threatened its shores. At night, when the palace quieted, she may have stood upon its balconies, looking out over the harbour where torches flickered upon the waves. She thought of Caesar, of his laughter, of the way his mind had moved like a river, swift, strong, unstoppable. She thought of her son, asleep within the palace, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. And she thought of the future, uncertain as the wind, yet hers to shape. The fall of Caesar had cast a long shadow, stretching from Rome to Alexandria. But Cleopatra had lived in shadows before. She had survived exile, intrigue, war. She had returned from every loss with new strength. And now, with Caesarion at her side, she resolved to endure once more. The Nile, eternal, flowed beneath the moonlight, its waters whispering of time and change. Empires rose and fell, kings lived and died, but the river carried on. And so too would Cleopatra, carrying her grief, her hope, and her unbroken will into the uncertain days that lay ahead. The years after Caesar's death were years of uncertainty. Rome trembled under civil war, its leaders divided, its streets filled with rival cries. From afar, Cleopatra watched and waited, guiding Egypt through the turbulence with care. Her son Caesarion, still young, was presented as Pharaoh beside her, yet she knew the stability of her throne depended not only on Egypt's strength, but on Rome's shifting tides. In time, a new figure rose from the storm, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies, now a leader of Rome's armies. Bold, charismatic, and adored by his soldiers, Antony was a man of appetite and ambition, a general whose laughter carried as easily as his commands. He, with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and Lepidus, formed the second triumvirate, dividing Rome's world between them. And among their tasks was the East, the rich lands, the ancient kingdoms, the provinces where Egypt gleamed like a jewel. It was to Antony that Cleopatra was summoned. The year was 41 BCE, and the meeting was to take place in Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, where the Cydnus River wound its way beneath the Mediterranean sun. Cleopatra did not come quietly. She understood, as always, the power of spectacle. To meet Antony, she chose not the plain path of diplomacy, but the dazzling road of enchantment. She sailed upriver on a barge gilded with gold, its purple sails catching the wind, its oars flashing silver as they dipped into the water in perfect rhythm. Musicians played soft flutes, their melodies carrying over the rippling current. Incense of cinnamon and myrrh rose in sweet clouds, perfuming the air, and upon the deck, beneath a canopy embroidered with stars, Cleopatra reclined in the guise of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Her robes shimmered with threads of gold, her jewels sparkled in the sun, her very presence a vision of divinity. Around her, attendants dressed as cupids fanned the air, their laughter mingling with the music. The people of Tarsus crowded the banks, their eyes wide with wonder, whispering that Venus herself had come to meet Antony. Can you imagine the sight? The river glowing with reflections of purple and gold, the air alive with fragrance and song, the city hushed in awe as the Queen of Egypt turned diplomacy into theatre. Antony, bold though he was, could not help but be captivated. For Cleopatra had not only entered his city, she had entered his imagination. When at last they met, it was as equals, their voices carrying both wit and weight. Antony, known for his laughter and his ease, found in Cleopatra a partner who matched him word for word, jest for jest, thought for thought. She who had spoken with Caesar, who had ruled through shadows and storms, saw in Antony a man of warmth and passion, a soldier whose loyalty was fierce and whose spirit was unrestrained. They dined together in splendor. Cleopatra's banquets became legend, tables heaped with roasted meats, figs and honey cakes, wine poured into cups of silver, lamps casting soft light on marble walls. Musicians played as dancers moved with grace, their shadows flickering in the glow. And at the center sat queen and general, their conversation flowing as freely as the wine, their laughter rising above the music. But their bond was not built on indulgence alone. Beneath the glitter of feasts lay politics as sharp as any sword. Cleopatra needed Antony's support to secure her throne, to protect Egypt from rivals both within and beyond. Antony, in turn, needed Egypt's wealth, its grain, its ships, its gold. Each saw in the other not only fascination but necessity. Their union was both alliance and enchantment, woven together in threads of desire and strategy. In time, Antony followed her to Alexandria. There, the city once again became a stage for splendor. Together, they created what came to be called the inimitable livers, a society of revelry and wit, where banquets stretched into dawn, where the air was filled with music, poetry, and laughter. Yet beneath the merriment was something deeper, companionship. For Cleopatra and Antony were in many ways alike. Both were bold, unafraid of spectacle, unashamed of appetite, and willing to gamble everything for greatness. Can you picture Alexandria in those days? Torches burning along colonnades, their light shimmering on marble. Courtyards filled with laughter, the scent of roses drifting on the night air. Barges gliding across the Nile, their decks alive with music and dance. The queen and the general seated together, their hands brushing, their eyes gleaming with shared ambition. Their bond grew into love, and from love came children. Cleopatra bore Antony twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, their names shining with the promise of sun and moon. Later, another son would be born, Ptolemy Philadelphus. For Cleopatra, these children were more than joy. They were the weaving of dynasties, the living symbols of Egypt and Rome entwined. Yet the world beyond their court did not rest. In Rome, Octavian watched. Cold, calculating, patient, he saw in Antony's devotion to Cleopatra not only personal indulgence, but political vulnerability. To the Senate, he whispered of Antony's enslavement to a foreign queen, of feasts and luxuries, of children born outside Rome. To the people, he painted Cleopatra as a sorceress, her beauty and cunning drawing Antony away from his Roman duty. But in Alexandria, these whispers seemed far away. There, Cleopatra and Antony ruled their days in brilliance, their bond strengthening, their vision of a shared empire growing. Together they dreamed of East and West united, of kingdoms stretching across seas, of children inheriting not only crowns, but legacies. At night, when the banquets had ended and the city grew quiet, they may have walked the palace gardens. The fountains murmured, the stars glimmered above the sea, the scent of jasmine filled the air. Cleopatra, her hand resting in Antony's, must have felt for the first time in many years, not the loneliness of rule, but the warmth of partnership. And Antony, roughened by battles and campaigns, must have found in her not only a queen, but a kindred spirit. Their story, however, was no simple tale of joy. The enchantment that bound them together also wove them into the larger struggle for Rome's future. For while Alexandria glittered with splendor, Rome's shadows grew longer. Octavian was patient, and the bond between Cleopatra and Antony would soon become both their strength and their peril. But for now, let us linger in these days of light. The days when the Queen of Egypt and the General of Rome laughed together beneath torchlight, when their banquets dazzled, when their children's cries echoed softly in the palace chambers. These were the days when love and alliance were inseparable, when ambition and desire flowed together like two rivers joining at last. The Nile carried their reflections, the stars watched in silence, and history itself paused, as if to marvel at the enchantment of Antony and Cleopatra, two worlds entwined. The Palace of Alexandria glowed brighter than ever before, its marble halls, washed in sunlight by day and golden lamplight by night, became the stage for one of history's most dazzling courts. Music drifted through its colonnades, laughter echoed across its gardens, and the Nile itself seemed to gleam with reflected splendor. Cleopatra and Mark Antony ruled together, their names entwined not only in politics, but in legend. For Antony, Egypt was more than a refuge. It was a realm of wonder. He had known the dust of Roman campaigns, the iron clang of battlefields, the cold marble of the Senate. But here, in Alexandria, life unfolded in brilliance. Banquets stretched into dawn, where tables groaned under roasted peacocks, figs dipped in honey, and wine flowing like rivers. Guests reclined on couches draped in silk, listening to poets recite verses as dancers moved with grace. Musicians plucked lyres and flutes, their melodies mingling with the sea breeze drifting in through open windows. At the heart of it all was Cleopatra, radiant, assured, her presence weaving together spectacle and sovereignty. She was no mere consort, no hidden queen in the background. She was Pharaoh, seated beside Antony as equal partner, her voice as commanding in council as it was enchanting in song. Together, they embodied a vision that dazzled their followers. Not merely Egypt and Rome joined in alliance, but a new empire, vast and radiant, stretching from the Nile to the Aegean, from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Armenia. They spoke of it openly, their dreams rising like incense in the air. Antony granted Cleopatra lands once beyond Egypt's reach: Cyprus, parts of Syria, the rich territories of Cilicia. Their children, still young, were given titles that glittered with promise. Alexander Helios, son, styled as ruler of Armenia and Parthia; Cleopatra Selene, moon, destined for Libya; Ptolemy Philadelphus, named Lord of Lands in Asia Minor. Caesarion, her firstborn, stood as Pharaoh beside her, the living son of Caesar, a bridge between worlds. Can you imagine the ceremonies where these titles were bestowed? great processions through Alexandria's streets, lined with cheering crowds, priests in linen chanting hymns, incense curling skyward. Antony, dressed as Dionysus, god of wine and revelry, his crown of ivy gleaming in the sun. Cleopatra, adorned as Isis, goddess of motherhood and magic, her golden diadem catching the light. Their children beside them, small yet solemn, draped in robes that glittered with jewels. The people of Alexandria gazed upon the spectacle and whispered of a new age. An age where East and West would no longer be divided, but joined in brilliance. The court itself became a world of legend. Known as the inimitable livers, Antony and Cleopatra gathered poets, philosophers, generals, and nobles into a circle of revelry and debate. They dined not only on delicacies, but on wit, jest, and story. At one banquet, Cleopatra is said to have dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar, drinking it to win a wager that she could host the most expensive feast in history. Whether truth or legend, such tales captured the spirit of the court, a place where wealth was boundless, where imagination reigned, where spectacle itself was a kind of power. But beneath the brilliance lay ambition as sharp as steel. Cleopatra's vision was clear: to secure her dynasty, to ensure Caesarion's place as Caesar's true heir, to expand Egypt's influence beyond the Nile. Antony's vision, too, was vast: to conquer Parthia, Rome's rival in the east, and to rule not as a subordinate to Octavian, but as master of half the world. Together, their dreams intertwined, dreams as radiant as gold, as intoxicating as wine. At night, when the banquets quieted and the courtyards stilled, they must have spoken of these dreams in softer tones. The stars above Alexandria burned bright, the same constellations Cleopatra had studied as a child. The fountains murmured, the sea lapped gently at the harbour walls. Perhaps Antony, leaning back with a cup of wine, spoke of battles yet to fight, of lands yet to claim. Perhaps Cleopatra, her hand resting on his, spoke of their children, of the world they might inherit. Their voices mingled with the night, weaving visions that stretched far beyond the horizon. Yet even as they dreamed, shadows lengthened. In Rome, Octavian watched. Cold and calculating, he understood the power of image. While Cleopatra and Antony presented themselves as gods in Alexandria, Octavian painted them as enemies of Rome. He whispered of decadence, of foreign luxuries, of Antony abandoning Roman virtue for the spell of an Eastern queen. He reminded Romans that Antony had once been their general, their champion, but now seemed enthralled by a woman draped in gold. The Senate, swayed by Octavian's words, grew restless. To them, Antony's distribution of lands to Cleopatra and her children, known as the donations of Alexandria, was an act of treachery, a sign that he meant to divide Rome's power and crown foreign heirs. The brilliance of Alexandria, so dazzling within its walls, became in Roman eyes a threat, a beacon of rebellion. Cleopatra and Antony must have known the risk. They had lived long enough among whispers to recognize their weight. Yet they pressed on, their dreams brighter than their doubts. For Cleopatra, every step forward strengthened her dynasty, secured her children, glorified her reign. For Antony, every feast, every campaign, every gesture in Alexandria affirmed his independence from Octavian's tightening grip. Can you imagine the atmosphere of those days? Alexandria glittering with festivals, its harbour filled with ships adorned with banners, its streets alive with music and procession. The queen and the general appearing before cheering crowds, their children lifted high, their visions spoken boldly, and beneath it all, the distant rumble of Rome's discontent, like thunder rolling far beyond the horizon. Still, within the city, life thrived. Farmers sowed their fields along the Nile. Scholars debated in the library's shadow. Merchants filled the markets with silks, spices, and ivory. Priests lit lamps in temples, their hymns rising into the sky. And in the palace, Cleopatra and Antony lived their golden court, weaving each day with laughter, ambition, and hope. The Nile flowed steady, carrying barges heavy with grain, its waters reflecting the splendor of a city at its peak. To those who walked Alexandria's streets, it must have seemed that the age of Cleopatra and Antony would last forever, that their dreams of empire were as unshakable as the stars. But history, like the river, carries both calm and flood. And even as Alexandria shone in brilliance, the current of fate was already shifting. For Rome's patience was running thin, and Octavian's shadow grew longer with each passing day. The golden glow of Alexandria's court could not hide the shadows lengthening beyond its walls. While Cleopatra and Antony dreamed of empire, Rome's heart grew restless. Octavian, sharp as flint and cold as marble, watched from across the sea. To him, their splendor was not wonder, but threat. And in whispers carried through the Senate and the streets of Rome, he began to weave a story that would turn allies into enemies and admiration into fear. Octavian's weapon was not only his legions, but his words. He painted Antony as a man undone, a Roman general bewitched by a foreign queen. He spoke of the feasts in Alexandria, the pearls dissolved in wine, the laughter that echoed through marble halls while Rome's duty was forgotten. He declared Cleopatra not pharaoh, but sorceress, her beauty and wit snares that bound Antony's loyalty away from his people. And as these tales spread, Rome began to see not the grandeur of Alexandria, but the image of betrayal. For Antony, the accusations struck deep. He had once been Caesar's most trusted ally, a commander adored by his soldiers, a Roman of Romans. Now Octavian whispered that he had abandoned Rome for Egypt, forsaken discipline for decadence, traded honor for love. To answer such charges, Antony would need not only words, but war. And so, the world tilted toward conflict. The alliance between Cleopatra and Antony, so dazzling in Alexandria, became the target of Rome's wrath. Octavian rallied support, his voice steady, his promises clear. He would defend Rome from foreign entanglement, from Cleopatra's ambition, from Antony's betrayal. The Senate, swayed by his resolve, granted him authority. War was declared not against Antony alone, but against Cleopatra, against Egypt itself. The news must have reached Alexandria like a chill wind sweeping through sunlit halls. Cleopatra, seated upon her throne, knew at once what it meant. This was no longer only Antony's struggle, it was hers. Rome had named her an enemy, her crown a target, her very life bound to the outcome of war. Still, she did not falter. She had endured exile, betrayal, and siege. She had returned from every trial stronger. Now, standing beside Antony, she resolved to face Rome, not in shadows, but in open battle. Together, they gathered their forces, Egypt's fleet, its soldiers, its treasure, and prepared for the storm. The harbour of Alexandria filled with ships. Their sails, stitched with purple and gold, caught the desert winds. Their prows gleamed with bronze, their oars flashed in the sun. From the decks came the sound of drums and horns, the voices of soldiers singing as they readied themselves for war. Cleopatra, appearing before her people in robes of white and gold, promised them that Egypt would stand, that their queen would not bow, that the Nile itself would guard them. And so, the stage was set for one of history's great battles. The year was 31 BCE. The place, Actium, a narrow bay on the western coast of Greece. There, the fleets of Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's forces, commanded by his brilliant general Agrippa. The sea stretched wide and glittering, the morning sun catching the waves as ships maneuvered into place. Can you imagine the scene? The crash of waves against hulls, the creak of oars dipping in unison, the cry of gulls circling above. On one side, Cleopatra's flagship, its sails bright, its decks lined with archers. Beside her, Antony's vessels, their prows ready for ramming. Across the waters, Octavian's fleet, disciplined and steady, their smaller, swifter ships waiting for the moment to strike. For hours, the battle raged. The sea churned with chaos, ships colliding, fire spreading, smoke rising into the sky. The clash of steel rang out over the water, the shouts of men mingling with the roar of waves. Cleopatra, aboard her flagship, commanded her fleet with determination, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Antony, fierce as ever, led his men with courage, but fate, like the tide, began to turn. Agrippa's ships, lighter and more maneuverable, outflanked their opponents. Confusion spread among Antony's ranks. The sea that had glittered with promise now heaved with peril. And in that moment of despair, Cleopatra made her choice. She unfurled her sails and broke from the battle, her fleet retreating toward Egypt. Antony, seeing her departure, could not remain. His loyalty, his love, his fate were bound to hers. Abandoning the fight, he followed, his ships cutting through the waves after her. Behind them, their forces collapsed, their dream of empire shattering upon the waters of Actium. The news spread swiftly. Octavian had triumphed. Antony and Cleopatra had fled. The Mediterranean, once alive with the hope of their vision, now belonged to Rome. In Alexandria, the palace that had once glowed with laughter fell quiet. The people who had cheered their queen now whispered at fear. Soldiers who had once marched proudly now looked to the horizon, dreading Rome's approach. Cleopatra and Antony, returned from Actium, carried not victory but despair. Yet Cleopatra, even in defeat, did not surrender her spirit. She withdrew into the palace, gathering what strength remained. She secured her treasure, negotiated with envoys, sought every path of survival. Antony, broken by the loss, drifted between fury and sorrow, but she, though grieving, remained composed. For she had known since childhood that fortune was fragile, that power shifted like sand. If there was still a chance to protect her children, to preserve her throne, she would find it. But beyond Alexandria, Octavian marched. His legions, disciplined and relentless, advanced with the certainty of Rome itself. The dream of Antony and Cleopatra, a golden empire, a dynasty of sun and moon, was fading. Ahead lay only the shadow of Rome's victory and the final chapters of their story. The Nile still flowed, silver in the moonlight, steady and eternal. But for Cleopatra, its whisper was no longer of triumph or renewal. It was the whisper of farewell, the soft murmur of a world slipping away. The city of Alexandria had always lived in brilliance. Its lighthouse shone like a star across the sea. Its library housed the wisdom of the ages. Its streets rang with the hum of traders and scholars. But after the defeat at Actium, a hush seemed to fall over the city. The people moved with quiet steps, their voices lowered, their eyes glancing often toward the horizon. They knew Rome was coming. Within the palace, silence replaced laughter. The banquets and music of earlier years had faded. Instead, the halls echoed with the measured tread of guards, the rustle of scribes recording orders, the low murmur of advisors. Cleopatra moved through these corridors with calm composure, though the weight upon her shoulders was heavier than ever before. She had known exile, she had known triumph, but now she faced something more daunting: the slow unraveling of everything she had built. Antony bore the defeat differently. Once a man of boundless energy and charisma, he now drifted between rage and sorrow. He spent long hours alone, staring into the courtyards. His thoughts turned inward, his spirit broken. At times he rallied, joining Cleopatra to discuss defenses. But the fire that had once defined him was dimmed. His soldiers, once fiercely loyal, now felt the despair of their commander. Cleopatra, however, did not surrender to grief. She knew her people still looked to her, that her children's futures depended on her strength. She set about securing what could be secured. She gathered treasure, hiding it in secret vaults. She strengthened the palace defenses, prepared supplies, and opened negotiations with Octavian's envoys. In every gesture, she sought to preserve something: her throne, her dynasty, or at least the safety of her children. The city itself reflected her determination. The harbour still bustled with fishermen and merchants, though beneath their daily labours lay unease. Farmers still brought grain down the Nile, though their songs were quieter. Priests still lit incense before the statues of Isis and Horus, though their prayers carried a note of sorrow. Alexandria was alive, but it lived as a city waiting for Rome, waiting for the end, waiting for the choice their queen would make. Can you imagine the atmosphere of those days? The air heavy with summer heat, the sky bright yet oppressive, the sea calm but carrying distant rumours of Roman sails. Streets once filled with joy now lined with anxious faces. And above it all, the lighthouse still shone, its fire steady, as if indifferent to the fate of those who lived beneath its light. In the palace gardens, Cleopatra found what peace she could. She walked among the roses and jasmine, their fragrance reminding her of earlier days, of laughter with Antony, of the cries of her children when they were small. She spoke often with Caesarion, now a boy on the edge of youth, guiding him with gentle words, reminding him of his duty and his heritage. She watched her younger children, the twins and little Ptolemy, playing in the shade of columns, their innocence both comfort and sorrow. For she knew the world they would inherit was uncertain, their safety fragile, their lives tied to the decisions she would make in these final days. Antony too walked those gardens, though his steps were slower, his gaze distant. Cleopatra must have seen in him both the man she had loved and the shadow of his decline. Yet even in his despair, there were moments of tenderness. At times he would lift a child in his arms, smiling faintly, or sit beside Cleopatra in silence, their hands brushing as they gazed together at the setting sun. In those quiet hours, they were not rulers or warriors, but man and woman, bound by love and loss. The tension grew as Octavian's legions drew nearer. Reports came daily. Rome was advancing, Rome was relentless, Rome would not be bargained with for long. Cleopatra tried still to negotiate. She sent envoys, offered treasure, sought terms. Some say she even contemplated yielding the throne in exchange for her children's safety. But Octavian, cold and steady, had already resolved to claim Egypt, not merely to bend it. For him, the queen was not an ally, but a symbol to be broken, a crown to be taken, a story to end. The city seemed to hold its breath. Nights were filled with uneasy quiet, broken only by the sound of waves against the harbour walls. Lamps burned late in the palace, their glow spilling across the marble floors where Cleopatra and her advisors debated what little hope remained. Soldiers kept watch along the walls, their armour glinting faintly beneath the stars. And the people waited, listening for the tramp of Roman boots that could arrive at any moment. In these final days, Cleopatra's resolve was clear. She adorned herself as Pharaoh, appearing before her people with dignity intact, even as shadows lengthened. She reminded them that Egypt had endured for millennia, that its spirit was older than Rome, older than any conqueror. She walked among the temples, offering incense, her voice steady in prayer. The people bowed not only to their queen, but to the strength she embodied, even as their world trembled. Antony's end came sooner. In one final clash, as Octavian's forces pressed closer, Antony's soldiers faltered. Defeated, his spirit broke at last. Believing Cleopatra already lost, he fell upon his sword. Word reached her swiftly. She rushed to his side, finding him wounded, his breath faint. Together, they shared their final moments, their hands entwined, their voices soft with love and farewell. Antony, once Rome's boldest general, died in the arms of the woman who had been his companion in both glory and sorrow. Can you picture the scene? The queen bending over her fallen lover, the marble floors cool beneath them, the air heavy with incense and silence. Around them, servants and soldiers stood still, their faces lowered. The palace, once alive with revelry, now hushed by grief. Cleopatra, though heartbroken, did not allow despair to consume her. She arranged Antony's burial with honor, ensuring he was laid to rest as a soldier and a man beloved. She wept, but she did not falter, for she knew her story was not yet ended. Octavian was coming, and she still held her crown, if only for a little longer. And so Alexandria waited, its breath held, its fate suspended. The lighthouse still shone, steady and indifferent, as the city beneath it stood poised between past and future, between queen and conqueror, between life and legend. The palace of Alexandria had grown quieter still. Its marble floors, once alive with the shuffle of soldiers and the laughter of children, now carried only the soft steps of attendants. Outside, the city trembled beneath the weight of Rome's arrival. Octavian's banners fluttered beyond its gates. His legions camped along the shores of the Nile. Within, Cleopatra remained, queen still, though her throne was no longer secure, her crown no longer certain. She had lived through exile, through triumph, through love and loss. She had seen Caesar fall, had watched Antony die in her arms. Now, at last, she faced her own end. Yet in these final days, she carried herself with the same composure that had defined her reign. She adorned herself in royal robes, draped in gold and white, her diadem shining faintly in the lamplight. To her attendants, she spoke not with despair, but with quiet command. Octavian demanded her submission. He wished to parade her through Rome, a conquered queen led in chains, her story displayed as proof of his victory. But Cleopatra, daughter of the Nile, Pharaoh of Egypt, would not be remembered as spoil. She had ruled as Isis incarnate, as Pharaoh in truth, as the last in a line that stretched back to the dawn of history. She would not let her final image be one of humiliation. In the stillness of her chamber, she made her choice. Death, yes, but death on her own terms, as queen, as legend. The means remain wrapped in mystery. Ancient writers spoke of a serpent, an asp smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figs, its venom quick and quiet. Others claimed she carried poison hidden in a comb of her hair, or that her attendants brought her a draught prepared in secret. Whatever the truth, it was not the manner of her passing that mattered, but the dignity with which she embraced it. Can you picture the scene? The chamber dimly lit by oil lamps, their flames flickering against painted walls, the air thick with the fragrance of myrrh and lotus. Cleopatra seated calmly, her robes gathered around her, her crown upon her brow. At her side, her loyal attendants Eros and Charmian, who had followed her through every turn of fortune, now stood ready to follow her even into death. The queen raised her hand, steady, composed, her eyes bright with resolve. She would not be led to Rome. She would not be stripped of her sovereignty. She would leave this world as she had lived in it, on her own terms. Her attendants wept softly, but she quieted them with a glance. She spoke of her children, of Caesarion, of the dynasty she had fought to preserve. She whispered prayers to Isis, goddess of life and rebirth, her voice low and steady. Then, as the serpent, or the poison, did its work, her breath slowed, her body relaxed, her spirit slipped gently into silence. When Octavian entered, he found her lifeless, regal still, her beauty undimmed by death. The crown remained upon her brow, the dignity upon her face. Beside her, her attendants lay as well, faithful to the end. For Octavian, it was both victory and defeat. Victory in possession of Egypt, defeat in being denied his triumph. He had sought to parade her before Rome, but Cleopatra had chosen instead to become a legend. The news spread swiftly. The queen was gone. Alexandria fell silent, its people mourning not only a ruler, but an era. For with Cleopatra's passing, the line of pharaohs ended. Egypt, once proud and sovereign, became a province of Rome. The temple still rose, the Nile still flowed, the lighthouse still burned, but the crown was no longer Egypt's own. Yet Cleopatra's story did not fade. From that moment, she became more than queen. She became myth. To some, she was remembered as enchantress, her beauty the snare that had undone great men. To others, she was the embodiment of sovereignty, a ruler who stood against the might of Rome with grace and courage. To Egypt, she remained Pharaoh, beloved of Isis, the last daughter of the Nile. Can you imagine how her memory lingered in Alexandria? Mothers telling their children of the queen who spoke their tongue, who sailed the Nile with splendor, who stood unafraid before Rome itself. Priests whispering her name in temples, remembering her devotion to the gods. Scholars recording her story on papyrus, knowing that her life had marked the final chapter of Egypt's ancient independence. Her children's futures were uncertain. Caesarion, her eldest, was taken by Octavian's men and did not live to claim his throne. The younger ones, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selina, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were carried to Rome, raised under foreign skies. Yet even as her dynasty faded, Cleopatra's name endured, carried by poets, historians, and the whispers of time. The Nile flowed on, as it always had. Its waters glimmered beneath the moon, its floods nourished the fields, its currents whispered of eternity. And upon its banks, though her body lay in a tomb beside Antony, her spirit seemed to linger, in the lotus blossoms drifting on the water, in the stars shining above the desert, in the eternal rhythm of Egypt itself. For Cleopatra was never only a queen, she was a bridge between worlds, Greek and Egyptian, woman and pharaoh, mortal and divine. She was a ruler who spoke many tongues, who moved through shadows and storms, who endured betrayal and loss, and yet always returned to stand tall. She was a mother, a lover, a leader, a dreamer. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt and the first queen of legend. As the centuries passed, her story was told and retold, in scrolls and in stone, in plays and in poems, in whispers by candlelight, and in the grand stages of history. Some remembered her as cunning, others as tragic, others still as radiant. Yet all agreed on one thing: she was unforgettable. Tonight, as we close her story, imagine the Nile under moonlight, its waters moving gently, its surface silver with reflected stars. Somewhere in that eternal current, Cleopatra's story flows still, not bound to time, not silenced by death, but carried onward, endlessly, like the river itself. May her spirit, regal and resilient, remind us that even in the face of overwhelming power, dignity endures. And may her legacy, woven into history's fabric, be a comfort, a reminder that stories never truly end. Rest now beneath the quiet sky. Cleopatra's journey is complete. The queen is gone, but her legend remains, timeless, enduring, eternal.